Why did a local newspaper editor from San Mateo end up in Russia? We have the fascinating story of Michelle Carter. Stay tuned, because the better part starts now. I'm Ann Zeiss with The Better Part. Today I'm talking to Michelle Carter. Join us as she relates her Russian adventure. She helped bring to flower a free press in an emerging democracy. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
What motivated you to leave your comforting life here in the peninsula to launch off into a foreign land half a planet away?
Well, it wasn't as though I just one day up and decided to go to Russia. I'd been traveling in Russia for 6 years when the invitation came to be the United States Information Agency's journalist in residence. I'd already written a book about Russia. The first book was about the relief efforts after Chernobyl. So it wasn't just a get up and go. And in fact, my husband and I talked about it for 3 months before we decided whether or not to accept the invitation. But Russia's been part of my soul since I was in high school. I studied Russian in high school, and I'm a Russophile of the first order. So it was as though my husband frequently said, this is a continuation of where your life has been and where it's going. You should go. So I did.
How much of an issue was the language? Were there cultural missteps that you made?
I made many cultural missteps, but language was, in fact, that was one of the biggest questions I asked myself, my husband, and everyone else, was what if my Russian isn't good enough? But the response from everybody was, just think how great it'll be when you come back. I had survival level Russian. I was not fluent, but I set myself a challenge. My challenge was that every day I would do one thing I had not done before. And sometimes that was just ordering a different cut of meat from the butcher's or something like that, but that's how it went. But as far as cultural taboos and making mistakes and not knowing what I was doing living in a country as opposed to just visiting it, I think my smoke detector story is one of the best. I like this. This is an excerpt from the book, and the chapters in the book are divided by the my letters from Russia that I sent back to the San Mateo Times while I was there. Mm-hmm. So this is an excerpt. Not long after I moved into my own flat in Moscow to begin my year as an expat in Russia, I was doing laundry in my bathtub. I had just set up my folding wooden clothes rack, 5,000 rubles at the Kiev railroad station, Rynok, when my smoke alarm started beeping. I'd installed it in the entryway inside the padded Naugahyde door just to please my husband, who worried about these things. And I had absolutely no plan for what to do if it went off. I didn't smell smoke, so I opened the door to the landing a tad and caught a whiff coming from the lift. In just a few seconds, it was puffing out enough smoke to fill the 5th floor landing. I slammed the door and did what I would do at home in California if something in my home caught fire. I grabbed the red plastic phone, turned over the receiver where I had taped the number for police and fire, and dialed. I gave my address in my most careful Russian and told them the lift was on fire. By the time I hung up, I could hear a commotion in the hallway. My next-door neighbors were all on the landing sloshing basins of water into the lift. But the fire was crawling up the back wall and gaining oomph from the fresh air pouring in once the door was open. Right behind them, the neighbors on the other side were the neighbors on the other side with their pails full. The fire hissed back, sizzled, and went out. Of course, my smoke detector was still beeping its heart out. I dragged the kitchen table over, climbed up, and popped the battery out to shut it up. Then I joined my neighbors on the landing with some rags to start cleaning up. That's when I told them I'd called the fire department and launched a new firestorm. "No, no, you never call the firemen," they shouted at me. "They will just come and look in your apartment and see what you have for them to steal. Don't call the police either. They will steal everything." I kept repeating how sorry I was, that I didn't know I shouldn't call. The neighbors on either side of me were sharing the emotional pain of having to explain the realities of life to the Americanka when we heard the sirens. In an instant, they scuttled like June bugs into their flats, slammed the doors, and snapped all the deadbolts. I stood there, holding sopping towels and gaping, trying to take in what had just happened. I heard the firemen, but I tried to send them away. I called down from the 5th floor to tell them the fire was out, that I didn't need them. Would they please go away? Not a chance. They clambered up the stairs armed with fire extinguishers and peered into the lift. However, the real object of their interest was the Americanka, me. No Muscovite in her right mind would have called them for a fire in the lift. I told them I only called because my smoke detector went off. Now the guy in charge took over. "What's that?" "Smoke detector. It tells me if there's a fire." "Show me this smoke detector." Now I knew I was in trouble. I could almost hear my neighbors huddled behind their dead-bolted doors, clucking, "No, no, don't do it." But I did, and what a show it was. Once I got the batteries back in, the firemen all crowded into my entryway and took turns setting the gizmo off by lighting matches under it and cheering it on. No doubt about it, it had to be the only smoke detector in Moscow. It was nearly an hour before they were gone. I went back to finish cleaning up the lift. Somehow I felt responsible for the mess. I'd barely gotten back to my laundry when Team 2 showed up. The commander or captain or whatever he was had decided that this was a find worth sharing. For the rest of the afternoon, firemen came up in shifts to flick their lighters under my smoke detector and chuck each other on the shoulder as it burst out beeping. I was exhausted by the end of the day. I wasn't the least bit worried about the firemen coming back to steal me clean, but I felt awful about disappointing my neighbors. I didn't see them for days, so I know they were waiting behind closed doors until they heard me leave. Their disapproval hung in the air.
That's a good story.
Thank you.
Well, give us some examples of how the Russians made you feel like an outsider or right at home.
I felt like an outsider frequently when I had my dog and pony show on the road, talking with newspaper editors throughout the country, across all 11 time zones, which was from Arkhangelsk in the north to Astrakhan in the south, and from Kaliningrad in the west to Vladivostok in the east. I covered all of the country. So many times I felt like the odd one out, because I was the Americanka who showed up, the journalist, the editor, to talk to them about what it meant to create a newspaper and have a newspaper succeed when you're no longer getting support from the government, and the government is no longer providing you with what they want you to put into it. So many times I was the odd person out, and I actually had to do a little convincing of what was required. But as far as the people who were around me, my neighbors, even the neighbors who I drove crazy sometimes, they were astonished that I was an American woman of a certain age. I was 50, of a certain age, who was there without her family. Because in Russia and much of Eastern Europe, your family is your support system. If you can't feed yourself, it's your family who's going to feed you. If you need childcare, it's your family who's going to provide it. So pretty much they all decided that they would be my family. And I would come home and find tickets to the symphony, or pots of soup or whatever on my doorstep. But what really, really brought it all home is when I came back after my husband died, and they all knew what had happened, and they were in every way my family. And I felt comforted, even cocooned, sometimes too much so, but they were there for me in every way. And also I had friends. I have 3 godchildren in Russia, so I had really good friends who were also there to help in any way that I needed it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. What did you notice concerning any type of government surveillance of your activities, either overt or covert?
When I was there in 1995, which is when I'm writing about in this book, the circumstances were such that I didn't feel observed in any way. I was very careful to keep myself from the cocoon of the State Department. I didn't live in the embassy. I didn't live in the compound. I lived in an apartment building where all my neighbors were Russians. So it was an issue that needed attention, and I paid attention to it. But I wanted to be separated from them. So it wasn't anything that I saw as a serious problem.
And you write that the Russian press was flowering in 1995. Compare and contrast those times with the situation now.
Well, I refer to it as a bubble of freedom. I was there in 1995 when all things were possible. It was a period of perestroika and glasnost that spilled over from when Gorbachev was the premier, and then the end of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin was the president at the time, and he was a bit of a buffoon and a drunk, but he was still an interesting and lovable kind of guy. But we believed then that truly what we were creating then would go on forever. We believed that we had that we were building newspapers that were going to be able to continue to what they were doing then into the end of my lifetime. We had ultimate hope. But this bubble of freedom, this pre-Putin, post-Soviet bubble of freedom, really only lasted about 8 years. And now the circumstances are very different, because newspapers, with the exception of a couple, perhaps Novaya Gazeta and a couple others, are really doing journalism. Hard-nosed, hard question asking journalism. But it's not as though it's not happening. It's happening online. It's happening on Facebook. It's happening on Instagram. It's happening on YouTube. For example, Daniel Navalny, who's the protest leader in Moscow, he has a YouTube channel that he, when he's not in jail, spends considerable amount of time talking to all the people who support him, and they in turn spread the word even further. It's remarkable to me the freedom that I see in my Facebook friends who are posting things that I would think would get them in enormous trouble, and does get them in enormous trouble. but they certainly have no fear about it. And in fact, it's a little bit of the poking Putin in the eye to just put the most outrageous things on there. And also, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty do a fabulous job of taking up where the press leaves off in Russia. But it's not safe. It's very, very dangerous to be a journalist who does a journalist's job in Russia. Very recently, a reporter for Novaya Gazeta, new newspaper, went into Chechnya, and they are in a constant state of rebellion in this republic, although there's a Putin puppet now who's in charge. But at any rate, she went into Chechnya and spent quite a bit of time documenting rumors that gay men were being rounded up and imprisoned, and that as many as 1,100 gay men had disappeared from their families. And their families were asking the question, where are they? Where are they? So she went down and she wrote, she stayed for about 3 months interviewing the families and others. And she wrote a series of articles that appeared in Novaya Gazeta. And almost immediately, she had to leave the country because death threats, somebody showed up in her lift the day after they appeared. She ran, was able to get back into her apartment successfully and protect herself. She's now in hiding somewhere in Europe. So this is the kind of thing that happens. I'm not suggesting that that was inspired by the central government, but certainly the Chechen government was very interested in seeing her disposed of.
That's scary.
Yeah.
Socially and intellectually, what were your most challenging experiences as an American woman in a patriarchal society? Tell us how your gender was an issue.
My gender was an issue all the time. It was an issue for women as well as men. For Russian women are the strongest women in the world. They are the reason why Russia survived the Second World War. They're the reason why the society exists with all of its cultural ramifications. The women are the backbone of this country. But they take their feminineness very differently than I take mine. And there were a few heads knocked over, not physically, but figuratively. For example, I walked to my office every day. I took the metro, walked to the metro, walked away from the metro to my office, and I always wore snow boots, or in the summertime, in the spring, I wore tennis shoes. I wore comfortable shoes for walking. When finally one day I asked one of the women in the office why she didn't wear comfortable shoes when she was commuting. When I got to the office, I did my Mr. Rogers routine. I changed into pumps and more appropriate office wear. And I asked why she didn't do that. And she said, Michelle, the way they pronounce it, which is just wonderful. You just don't understand. I wear these, and she pointed to these awful strappy pumps that she was wearing. As long as I can wear these, I'm young. And when I can't, I'm old. And by that time, I got it. I got what this was about, and I was ever so thankful that I was not living under those same kinds of moral requirements that she was putting upon herself and her sisters put upon themselves. But as for the men, Russian newspaper editors are almost all men, and they, at the time, and they didn't take kindly to taking any kind of direction from a woman. And some of the crusty old Soviet editors who were now suddenly thrust into this new world of having to learn how to make a newspaper, sell advertising, interview people, all of these things that they never had to do before. They weren't particularly thrilled to be getting this suggestions from an American woman. But I had an ace in the hole. I had this wonderful opportunity when I was in the very first year that I learned Russian to memorize poetry, especially the great romantic poets like Lermontov. And I would always seek some opportunity with these crusty old editors to whip out some of my Lermontov, and I would find some way to bring it into the conversation, and I'd say, as Lermontov said, "Выхожу один на дорогу, сквозь туман, кремнистый путь блестит." This is a famous poem and song in Russia, and invariably, the editor would pick up where I stopped, and together we would finish the poem. And from then on, he was beaming at me as if I was his daughter, and it worked. And that was a poem that I memorized when I was 16, and yet it carried me through still another year in Russia very well.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in the book, you're fairly critical of the treatment of women in Russia. How's that changed over the years? Compare the situation of Russian women and the situation of women in the West.
My objection to, women all over the world have serious issues, and Russian women have the same issues. But Russian women are raised by their mothers to raise their daughters to serve and their sons to be served. We talk often, my late husband and I, and my husband now, about the Russian princes, P-R-I-N-C-E-S, the princes of Russia, who every young man we met was in some way expecting his mother, his wife, his daughter, his aunt, whomever, to serve. And they did not. So it was really, the crunch was even greater in Russia. The burden on a woman, all women work in Russia. There is no such thing as a stay-at-home mom. But you do get to retire at 55 on a pension if there's a pension to be paid. And that's what was going on in 1995. The pensions were not being paid. So you had the circumstance of being dependent on your family if you got that far. But we used to say that they worked until they were 55 and ready to drop dead, but they had, from their retirement on, their husbands, they didn't have to worry about because they died at 55. So usually from drink and a variety of other things. So women, I think, in Russia carry a far bigger burden than the rest of the world.
You brought some items back with you, which we haven't had a chance to talk about. Would you care to tell us about them?
Well, these are my the lacquer boxes, which everybody who's been to Russia, I'm sure, has collected. But I particularly like red ones, and so I've learned how to tell the real artisan lacquer boxes from the ones who have decals just painted on top. So these are the real thing, and they're quite beautiful. This one is a lovely one, of a round one. You don't see too many round ones. And this one has Ruslani Ludmila on it, which is a famous folk tale and love story. And this one has the Firebird, of course. And these are just two knockoff icons, I could not bring my real one. I actually, in my first trip to Russia, bought for next to nothing an icon about this size. It's the Black Madonna icon, and thought nothing of it. It was obviously used. When I got home, I read an article that talked about how the Russian Orthodox churches were being raped, and icons were being sold, and it led me to check out and see if this was real, and it is. And I felt a great deal of guilt for having participated in this black market of icons. So I treat this one very gingerly and with great pride. But this is charoite. It's very heavy, and you can lift it and see.
Yeah, let's see.
Charoite is a mineral that is mined only in one place in the world. It's on the shores of Lake Baikal in Siberia. And there was a great story about it that was I read in the papers in 1990 when I was there, and that was that it was disappearing. The mineral was disappearing because Raisa Gorbacheva, the wife of Premier Gorbachev, who was despised most of the time she was in Russia, had tiled a bathroom in it. So that was that. But this was my going away gift when I left the office where I worked. They gave me this and told me it was to hold my Russian soul.
Well,
so
thank you very much, Michelle. So your Russian soul is in there, and you can keep it nearby.
Indeed.
Well, thank you very much. Wasn't Michelle's story fascinating? We hope you can join us again for another interesting episode of The Better Part. You can see all of our shows on YouTube, KMVT 15, or on Roku. Goodbye for now.